Welcome to the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. I'm Allie Rose, certified clinical hypnotherapist and subconscious success coach. I help my clients stop self-sabotage and feel safe to create more wealth, worth, and wellness from within. If you find yourself stuck repeating the same unhelpful patterns in your life, health, business, or relationships, even after all the mindset work, this podcast is for you. Each week, you'll hear deep dives into the hidden beliefs shaping your life and live hypno coaching sessions where someone shifts a block in real time. Because willpower isn't the problem, your subconscious story is. And when you shift it at the root, everything else begins to change. So let's dive in. Hello. Welcome back to the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the subconscious roots of people pleasing, what it looks like, where it comes from, and how you can make shifts and changes at a subconscious level to start untangling your worth from what other people think of you. So if you've ever felt like you're carrying the weight of everyone's emotions or you feel guilt, anytime that you say no, this episode is going to hit home for you. But before we dive in, as always, Safiya, how are you today? How are you feeling about diving into this topic?
I'm good. And I actually feel really good about diving into this topic. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine earlier about people pleasing, just randomly. So I'm really, I'm ready to dive into it and talk a bit more about it.
Nice. It's something that we talk about a lot in my home. We're constantly having conversations about it and about the way that it shows up and just how it's so deeply rooted. I feel really strongly about it. So it'll be interesting to dive into it today.
Yeah. And it's so funny because I think people pleasing is is somewhere along the spectrum of, I guess, being in a relationship, right? There's so much about the idea of being in relationships and compromise that overlaps with this idea of people pleasing. And so I think it'll be interesting to talk about how to differentiate between when you are, just doing something for someone else and when you are actually people pleasing. And I think that can be a really, for people who people please a lot, that line can feel really blurry.
Yes.
Um, so I am definitely looking forward to talking about this. Of course, we start the way I love to start. What are we talking about when we actually define people pleasing? Especially because, like I said, it's on such a spectrum along the things that we do for each other every day. So, what do we mean when we talk about people pleasing?
So for me, the way that I can tell that, someone is falling into people pleasing is that it's not just about being kind or about being nice. It's really about safety. It's really about what's the driving motivator behind why you're doing something that on the surface level appears like being thoughtful or reliable or easygoing. So,
Mhm.
what's driving that? Is that coming from a place of you wanting really deeply from a genuine, authentic place, wanting to do those things? Or is it coupled with a fear of what happens if I don't do those things, right? So it's a nervous system response that's trying to avoid conflict, rejection, or disconnection. So that's what I mean when I say people pleasing.
Okay, so it's less about the actual behavior, which may look the same on the outside, and more about your internal drivers towards what is leading you to do that.
Ye Yeah, so I just wanna say one more thing about that. It can be really hard because it's so deeply ingrained, it can be really hard for people to determine whether or not something's coming from that place of genuine desire or from a place of fear. And there can still be genuine desire, but you have to check in with yourself and see, like, okay, how much of this is genuine desire and how much of this is fear?
I love that sort of distinction and realizing that it can be quite difficult to distinguish it on the inside. And so there was something you said earlier too when you talked about worth, right? And I feel like that's another distinction that I like to think about because it's like How how is this tied up in your worth and how you feel about yourself? How is it tied up in your identity and the identity that you've created around being that easygoing person or being that yes person or sourcing your worth from what you think happens when you say yes to people versus the sort of kindness and interactions that we will have with each other each day or often we'll have with the people who live around us.
Yeah,
So I think
absolutely.
it's really like a nuanced thing that you have to kind of be able to sense within yourself. It's a lot harder for other people to sense it for you because it's such an integral.
It is, unless you live with someone who is, I don't know, we're in a unique situation, right? Like sometimes I say that Sophia, who, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know who Sophia is, she's my partner. So sometimes I say that she's very lucky in that I'm obviously like a trained therapist. So conflict or having certain conversations often looks a little bit different in our house. Sometimes I feel like it's not very lucky for her because I am so adept at noticing patterns in
Mm,
behavior that when I notice something that's coming up in her, I'm more likely to call it out, which can be a good thing, but it can also be a confronting thing because it's hard, I think, sometimes for people to face the patterns that they've had for such a long time in their life, right? So if you can be lucky if you have a friend or someone in your life who kind of calls that out in you and says, "Hey, this is what I'm noticing in you. Tell me a little bit more about that." Right?
yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. I have those friends and I am that friend sometimes, so I totally get that. And it's interesting. So what are some of the subtle ways that it can show up for people, particularly for people who may not be realizing that's part of the pattern?
A really obvious one is that I feel like is talked about all the time is saying yes when you mean no, right? But it can also be sneaky. So it can be over explaining so that no one's upset or apologizing when you haven't done anything wrong or just keeping your opinions to yourself to keep everything high vibe and good for everybody, not to make anyone uncomfortable, right? But really, the interesting thing that I want people to notice is that it can be the exhaustion that you feel after a very simple conversation, because during that conversation, you were managing everyone's emotions the whole time. You were on alert the entire time, trying to figure out what's the right thing to say in order to keep everyone's emotions kind of grounded and balanced, right? So sometimes it's not even about helping, it's about control and the illusion
Hmm.
that if you keep everyone happy, nothing will fall apart, right? So that's
Yeah.
how it can show up in people's lives.
Yeah. I now that you say that, I'm thinking about relationship that I had years ago where I felt like I worked really hard to almost anticipate what was coming. If he asked me a question, it wasn't about giving the answer, it was about trying to anticipate what I thought he would want the answer to be. It was totally messed up. It was a long time ago. But when you said that just now, I just had a flashback to, like, that idea of coming away from those conversations that should really be quite simple and be like, "Oh, shall like, I'm exhausted now," because I was almost holding, like, 17 different conversations in my head because, like, if he says this, and I'm gonna say that, and that type of I guess maybe that goes a bit beyond people pleasing. Maybe I've maybe I've said too much, but that was what the image that came to mind when you said it.
Right, and think about how exhausting that is to just be having a simple conversation or a conversation that should be simple on the
Mhm.
forefront, but it ends up being mental exhaustion because you're basically having, as you said, multiple conversations in your head because you're trying to anticipate what your next step should be, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
mentally exhausting.
It definitely is mentally exhausting. And yeah, that's just one of the ways, but as you said, there are other ways as well. So, let's think a little bit about the subconscious and how where does the subconscious come into play with this? How does that drive these patterns and these behaviors, especially because basically you're putting someone else's needs or their happiness or what you perceive will make them happy above what might make you happy or simply allow you to just be you.
Right. Well, so, okay, at the core, if we think about it from a subconscious perspective, and we know that the subconscious is always trying to keep us safe, then people pleasing is about regulating other people so that you don't have to feel uncomfortable or unsafe.
Hmm.
So it's the body and the subconscious saying, if they're okay, then I'm safe. Right? So that's how it shows up from a subconscious level, right?
Okay. So that's interesting because I think, we've talked a bit about safety in previous episodes in terms of other behaviors that show up in us as we try to manage our own sense of safety. Obviously, that's one of the big roles of the subconscious so that we can try to manage our own safety and keep ourselves feeling safe. But you talked about control, right? Like a part of it is trying to control the other people around us and feeling like that's the only way that we can create that safety in ourselves.
Right.
What type of childhood experiences do you find people who are people pleasers tend to experience? Or do you feel like there's some common sort of childhood experiences that leads people to be people pleasing bleh, that lead people to people pleasing? What childhood experiences do you find people have experienced that lead them to this type of behavior or the feeling that that's how they create safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can show up in many different ways. I don't think that there's a one size fits all. I think that for many, that kind of reflex forms early. Maybe your parents' mood dictated the entire tone of the house. So you learn to anticipate and adjust. And then you have to almost have that like hyper awareness around someone's moods and emotions because it becomes like a way to survive. I think there's also family dynamics where just in general, people feel very uncomfortable with uncomfortable emotions or with difficult emotions. And so you learn that everyone else is okay as long as you're okay. And as soon if you bring up something and you're not okay, then everyone else kind of falls apart. And so that can be very threatening to people to see the caregivers fall apart. And so you learn yourself, like, I must be pleasing to these people in my life in order to not make them feel uncomfortable by my big emotions or by my negative emotions. So it's kind of two different prongs. It's like there can be a lot of chaos, which then leads to you reading the room, reading people's emotions for survival. And then there can also be like maybe a very loving, safe household. But you notice that if you have an uncomfortable or something that's perceived as a negative emotion, that people around you or your caregivers then feel uncomfortable with that. So you learn, like, okay, I can't show that I'm uncomfortable or having like a quote unquote negative emotion. I must stay pleasing to everyone else around me. Right. So I don't know
Hmm.
that there's necessarily one way, but they're both tied into safety, but they're both tied into safety in different ways.
Yeah. And that's so interesting. I was thinking as we started talking about it, one of the things I was thinking about was because even though people pleasing isn't necessarily about being nice, I think for some people who've been socialized in different ways, sort of the not being nice can evoke that discomfort, right? When I was having the chat with my friend earlier today, we were talking about cultural differences because I'm in the UK and here it is very much a culture of don't rock the boat, very much politeness and all of this, or at least an old fashioned kind of culture like that.
Right.
And so this person, she was talking about the household that she grew up in, where it was very much like that. It was very much of like you're socialized to be polite and be nice and all of that to the point of real discomfort when you have emotions that go against how it feels that you're being socialized,
Right.
right? And on top of that, there is sometimes what feels like the gender thing, like because if I have a response and one of my male colleagues has the exact same response, I get a whole different type of treatment to that male colleague. So I think what also makes it difficult is that there are a lot of social elements that may be there. They may be there because of gender, they may be there because of the culture, and so, of course, that does threaten your safety because if the culture that you're in requires you to behave a certain way, you will feel unsafe if you step out of that. So, that was just something that came to mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It does feel, I think that that's like the biggest thing when you said it does feel that way. However, the reality is that I don't know, and maybe this is just me because I don't really struggle with people pleasing, but I'm like, do you really want to be a part of certain cultures where you can't fully and authentically be yourself? Or, and I'm not even saying like be mean or be aggressive. I'm just saying people get caught up in people pleasing to the point where they abandon themselves completely, right? So I think it's more
Okay.
so about finding a balance of how can I still be a part of these cultures, whether that's a family or a religious culture or, anything else or a workplace or something. How can I be a part of these cultures, but also not self-abandon at every
Mm,
single moment, right?
yeah. Okay. That's actually very good. I like that. It's like trying to find that balance, like you said, being true to yourself while still being a part of it. And one of the things that always leads me to think about is when you're getting to the stage of maybe you've tried to break out of people pleasing before, but people are so used to you behaving that way that it can actually cause like added friction when you come out of it and managing that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? People pleasing allows you to avoid guilt. When you say yes, you temporarily escape the discomfort of saying no, but
Mm,
the relief comes at the cost of building resentment, this bank of resentment, because you've then given pieces of yourself away over and over and over again, right? The subconscious will always prefer like short term safety over long term alignment. So it keeps repeating that same loop, but a lot of people get to a point where, like, there's, like, a breaking point where they can't do it anymore, right?
yeah. And that's interesting what you say about the subconscious preferring short-term safety because it is one of the benefits of people pleasing, isn't it? There's benefits for you or whoever is doing the people pleasing internally because you do get a boost from the subconscious of that sort of short-term safety. Are there any other almost benefits that people get from people pleasing which makes it really hard to give it up?
I think aside from what we've already talked about, I think there's comfort in identity because this starts often when you're so young. Being the helper or being the dependable one. It feels very familiar, even if it's exhausting. And familiar will always feel safer than being free to just be who you are because unfamiliarity means danger in our minds, right? So, and a lot of people like, we like to know who we are. And so again, going back to this idea of identity, it's
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, like I know what's expected of me. I can just easily fall into that role. So seeing the payoff doesn't mean that you like it. It just means that you understand it. It's familiar, right? So
Yeah.
it's not about, oh yeah, I really like this, but it becomes the older you get, often with most things, the more you start to realize that it's not necessarily working for you in the way that it used to work for you because there's an exhaustion that comes with it, right? So you realize that you are suffering as a result of this pattern in your life.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense because the payoff may become less and less when it requires more and more from you. So
Yes,
then you're
because
exhausted, you're
right. But your identity is as you get older. This is a very therapist thing to say, but it's like a differentiation thing. So when you're younger, you're very much more enmeshed with your family system. And so you get more and more of your identity from who your family, your school, your sports league, your church, who they say you are. But then as you get older, you start to differentiate from those systems and you start to say, well, do I really like my family does everything this way, but do I really like X, Y, and Z? And you start to realize, oh, I actually don't. Right. But what that does is that can play on, well, who am I if I don't fall into this? And the reason it gets harder as you get older is because you get farther and farther away. You become more individualized. And so the gap, the tension is bigger and wider, and it starts to feel heavier and heavier.
Okay. Yeah. I definitely get that. And and I guess that's part of the reason why it may it may just exhaust you more as time goes on. Like when you're a kid and you're doing it, is you
Yeah.
don't even think about how, whether it's exhausting or not, because it may very well not be. So that's really interesting. Why do you think there is so much exhaustion or such sort of emotion that comes with saying no and that idea of disappointing people?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about.
Mm.
The exhaustion comes from all of the mental gymnastics that you have to
Eh,
do. I'm like, I don't know if you've ever done gymnastics or anything, like, we can do something else. We can say whatever sport we wanna say, but it's like the mental soccer, the mental basketball, right? It's like
Yeah.
after you, like, played a really hard game of whatever sport or, you ran or something like that, like, that's what it can feel like to constantly be people pleasing.
Mm.
But also, there are physical effects. So, oftentimes when I'm working with people pleasers, what I hear a lot is that you get nauseous. There's a knot in your stomach, or there's a nausea that happens if you feel like you have to say or want to say no. That's not guilt. It's just a withdrawal from your familiar drug of approval, right? So,
Hmm.
you get these physical responses and reactions to going against the people pleasing identity, and that can be exhausting. It's anxiety, it's the mental energy that we just talked about with the gymnastics, it's the actual physical feeling of feeling nauseous or sick. It's
Mm.
all of this physical toll that it takes on you, or I'm thinking of people who, like, aches and pains in their neck because they're kinda, like, scrunched up from,
Mm.
from feeling that tension that they're feeling, that tension that they're holding whenever they're trying to, like, hold it all together in terms of, like, making sure that everyone else is happy with them.
Yeah, it's so interesting because whenever I've had these conversations with friends or with other people, at some point it was easier to say yes. And then eventually it becomes as hard to say yes as it does to say no. So it's the growing tension as you talked about it. We started talking about this earlier when I was talking about the spectrum between what looks like kindness and what looks like being in community, selflessness, things that, maybe are valued. How can someone tell the difference between that and the genuine generosity so that they can start to move from one state to the other?
Right. So, the difference lies in the why. Why am I doing the thing that I'm about to do? Why am I saying the thing that I'm about to say? Genuine kindness feels open, it feels choice based. People pleasing feels pressured, it feels anxious, it feels fear based. You're doing the same action, but one comes from that place of maybe love and another from fear. And I feel like maybe that's a little bit oversimplifying it, right?
Mm.
But you can also tell by how you feel afterward. True giving feels light. People pleasing feels heavy. We all, like, literally, I said I'm not a people pleaser, but there have been times when I have said yes to something that I've wanted to say no to. And that feeling that you get after you say yes to something that that you wanted to or that you should have said no to, right? It feels like you're just overspent emotionally, or like maybe there's some resentment that comes up, right?
Oh, definitely the resentment. I number of times I don't necessarily feel as a people pleaser like you, but there have been times when I've said yes, and when I've walked away, I was like, "Girl, you should have said no. You knew you should have said no." And yeah, so I definitely get that. And then what does healing look like? If healing isn't so much a change in behavior as it is a change in changing that internal pattern, what does that look like for real terms?
Yeah, so I posted this the other day about perfectionism is that it's not actually about lowering your standards. It was about raising your sense of safety in your life, that it's safe enough to be just enough as you are, to not have to strive toward perfection. And I would say the
Mm,
same is a bit true for people pleasing in that healing it isn't about becoming unkind or aggressive or detached. It's just about remembering that you matter too. So at first, it's going to feel unnatural. It's going to feel selfish because your body associates self care with risk. So the healing starts really small. Instead of saying yes right away, it might just look like saying, let me think about it and giving yourself the chance to say no. Just giving you could still say yes, but at least give yourself the chance to say no, right? Or noticing the urge to over explain, right? So the goal is not to stop caring, it's to care without abandoning yourself. And oftentimes that means letting discomfort exist. The tension of someone being disappointed, the tension of there being that uncomfortable silence that might happen, right? And so each time that you make these little deposits into creating space, it's like your nervous system learns that someone disapproving of you or being disappointed, it's not a life or death situation, that you
mm.
can actually handle that. It's expanding, again, therapist speak, it's expanding the distress tolerance, the tolerance that your body has for holding distress, right?
And I totally get that. I'm thinking of another example. I have a friend, and she's still a really good friend of mine to this day. But I have a friend, and I remember years ago, she asked me to do something, and I had that pause. You know, when you talked about like just saying, "Let me think about it." I didn't say, "Let me think about it," maybe in those words, but I had a chance to pause.
Right.
Just like, I really don't want to do this. I just physically couldn't. So I went back to her and I was like, I'm really sorry, I can't do it. And she was like, "Oh, no problem. I'll ask somebody else." And I think that was a big turning point for me because a big part of me not wanting to say no for a long time was I hated it when people told me no. Like it was also a response to how I felt when I felt rejected because
Mm.
that was how I was interpreting it, right? So I hated people telling me no, therefore I hate telling people no.
Right.
And when I said no and she was like, "Cool, no problem," I was just like, "Wait, what is happening here?" Like so many things happened for me. One, it was realizing, "Oh, you can say no and people are not gonna be as angry at me as I would be at them if they said no to me." And suddenly I was just like, "Huh, maybe it's not personal."
Hey.
And I still don't like when people tell me no, but I feel I have a lot less feelings about it, which I think also makes it easier for me to say no
Right.
or to say, "Eh, let me get back to you on that one," or something like that. So I like the idea of just creating a little bit of space so that
Right.
you can see how you feel about it,
Right.
and then it'll be you can decide. You might still decide to say yes. You might even still decide to say yes out of guilt or whatever, but I think the more you start giving yourself that space, the more you get to understand what your own preferences are, because I think sometimes people say yes because they don't actually know what they want.
Right.
So, I love that. I love that idea of taking the time or giving yourself that space for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is too, because this is such a core foundation of the work that I do, that it's about reparenting that younger version of you that learned that love had to be earned by being pleasing, right? So you start giving yourself what you once worked hard to get from others, which is acceptance and permission and safety within yourself. So telling yourself, no, it's safe for me to have needs. It's safe for me to have desires, right? It's okay that other people have them, but it's also okay that I have them as well. So again, what I often find is that people pleasers often what they do is it's a pendulum swing. So they're all the way to one side. And what happens then is that they go all the way to the other side. And they do sometimes in their recovery process go into being really strict, really firm with boundaries and maybe a little bit harsh, but it's just because they don't know how to do it yet in a way that feels balanced. But what I do find is that most people that are in recovery for people pleasing, the pendulum then swings back to more of a balance where they don't feel like they have to be harsh or set boundaries in this like really rigid way. They can do it in a way that honors themselves, but also honors someone else as well. So
Yeah.
I say that for everybody to kind of be aware that if this is something that you're struggling with, there may be a period of time where you're like, okay, I'm done with this pattern. And you almost feel like in order to recover that you have to go to the other side of things, especially when people are so used to you being a certain way.
Mhm.
You will swing back to the center. Give it time. I promise you, I have yet to see somebody who has not come back to center on that.
Oh, brilliant. That's good to hear. And it just reminds me, you talked about reparenting your inner child and you talked about that pendulum swing. I was reminded of my niece who is 3 years old, but she was about two at the time. And I remember she was so adamant about just saying no to everything, even the things that she wanted. And so sometimes you'd say to her, like, do you want something to eat? And you'd see it in her eyes, she's like, I want to say no, but I actually do want something to eat. And she'd be like, no. Like, "You
Right.
don't wanna say no," but she was just like, "I must say no, I must say no." And now I think she has a much better sense of, I'm not comparing anybody to a two-year-old, although I don't mind the comparison, but she has eventually developed a much better sense of, like, what she likes and what she wants and saying no. One of the last things I want to ask, and we sort of touched on it earlier, but maybe we'll need a whole other episode on this thing about boundaries and being able to set those boundaries as a people pleaser, because I think that sometimes what happens is that people people get into relationship patterns. So if you have a friendship, relationship, whatever, where you've always been a people pleaser and you've always said yes, sometimes when you start to say no and set those boundaries, there's a lot of friction
Sure.
because there's a change in dynamic, and that's hard. That's gonna be hard even for the other person on the other side, right? So, what are some ways of managing that?
Do you mean what are some ways to manage that feeling for yourself? What are some ways to manage that?
I would say managing that feeling for yourself, but I also think that that sort of dynamic change and that friction may make it harder for people to break out of those patterns because the very thing that they're afraid of is coming true.
Right. So here's the reality. Healing can be hard at times. Growth and change can be hard at times. That doesn't mean that it's not worth it. I have watched people go through this process of being very hardcore people pleasers to now setting boundaries. And I wish that there was like a magic wand that made it easier. And I think sometimes the only thing that makes it easier is coming back to why am I doing this? And a lot of
Mm,
times that's me sitting with someone and reminding them about how bad they feel when they allow someone to walk all over them, when they abandon themselves every single time, and reminding them why it's worth it to set the boundary. It's difficult. And sometimes when we're healing things, it's difficult. And so I think that that's part of the process is learning how to sit with the difficulty of it without thinking that there's something wrong or bad going on. Most people will respect that you are giving them a yes based on authenticity versus a yes based on inauthenticity, right? I honestly would rather someone say an authentic no to me than have someone say an inauthentic yes to me, right?
Mm, yeah, I get that. I definitely agree with that. And, you talk about sitting with discomfort. I have a friend who sometimes says to me, how she says yes because she feels guilty about saying no. And my thing is like, if you're gonna feel bad anyway, just say no. You know, at at least, if you're choosing between going somewhere and like staying home and like lying in the bath, right? And
Right.
it's like you wanna say no to going out so you can stay home and do something for yourself. I'm like, you're gonna feel bad anyway, but at least you'll be in the bath, like
Right.
that type of thing. So I think it's just like realizing that you're already feeling bad. So it's like, how do you kind of protect yourself as you go through this transition to get out to the other side?
Yes. I mean, it's like whenever like we take naps, but we feel bad about taking a nap. And so during the whole time that you're supposed to be taking the nap, you're thinking about all the things that you should be doing while you're taking. It's like, okay, if you're going to take the nap, then just let yourself take the nap. If you're going to sit there and berate yourself the entire time you're trying to take a nap, then just get up and do whatever things, right?
That was me on Monday, I'm not gonna lie. But anyhow, that's a different story for a different time. But yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one. And it's I like that you say it's hard and also it's worth it and that I guess you're giving yourself the gift of coming back to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, so if you really think about it, most things in life are worth it. There is some level of discomfort and difficulty. If you've ever lifted weights, if you've ever been in a relationship, trying to get healthy, like that can be difficult at times. But oftentimes, on the other side of that difficulty, there's a moment of feeling really proud of yourself. There's a moment of feeling really good in your body. If you've ever been in a relationship with someone, and you get past the honeymoon phase and you have these conflicts, when you get through the conflict and you recognize that your relationship with that person is now stronger, then it's worth it to go through the difficulty to get to that place of like, wow, we made it through that. Right. And so
Yeah.
I would say the same exact thing is true of, healing any sort of subconscious pattern that you see in your life. People pleasing is hard because it does involve other people. Whereas perfectionism is one where it can be more individual, whereas people pleasing can be a lot harder because other people are involved. But on the other side of all of that difficulty, there it is very worth it.
Mm. I love it. That's really great. I think that's a really great place to bring it to a close.
Wonderful. If after listening to our conversation today, you recognize that your deeply ingrained people pleasing is hurting you more than it's helping you, head to shiftyourstorypodcast.com and you can schedule a connection call or just message me on Facebook or Instagram. I would absolutely love to connect and chat with you to see how I could best support you and help you finally break free and shift your story around people pleasing. All right, we're sending you so much love and gratitude. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to send me a message on social media. I'm at the Ali Rose on both Facebook and Instagram. And if you want to be coached on a future episode or explore what it would look like to work with me one-on-one, head over to shiftyourstorypodcast.com. And if you never want to miss an episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review. It helps more people find this work. Until next time, keep shifting, keep growing, and most importantly, I want you to remember that your story isn't set in stone. You always have the power to shift it.